Hello and welcome to Seeds of Change, Tech Takes Root, brought to you by GDIT. I'm your host, George Jackson. Federal agencies face a rapidly evolving technology landscape that can entail more questions than answers. How do they perceive, adapt, and implement emerging tech? What hurdles do they face across the civilian, defense, and intelligence sectors? Or how can emerging tech impact their mission? GDIT's inaugural annual research study on emerging technology in government sheds some light on these potential blind spots, shares perspective from 400 government leaders, and offers a panoramic view of technology adoption from current state to future direction. Today, I'll dig into some of the study's key findings and glean insights from experts at the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and more. Let's kick things off with Michael Cole. He is Chief Technology Officer for Federal and Civilian at GDIT. Mr. Cole, welcome.
George, thank you. I'm excited to be a part of the conversation today.
We are pumped. And his colleague here at the table, Ricardo Paljano, Senior Solutions Architect at AWS. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Michael, kick us off. Your name is on this landmark study. Tell us about it. Just give us a broad framework for what you were looking for.
So, emerging technology is something that's always present, and we wanted to establish a baseline of what's going on within our federal government marketplace by actually talking to the people who are actually buying, procuring, and implementing those technologies within our customer base, right? So we went out and we surveyed, like you said, 400 or so government employees to get their feeling on what is emerging technology, how are they implementing it, what are the challenges they're facing, and what are the benefits that they see it providing to their mission.
A couple of things, Ricardo, that folks were looking for as the results of that study came out: real-time data, enhanced decision-making, improved productivity, and collaboration. I know that's a pretty broad landscape, and you could probably roll into a whole documentary of answers associated with it, but pull something out of there for me.
Sure. Yeah. So, let's take just one example. One thing that comes into play, I think, is the edge. So having that tactical edge capability, that's going to be really important for emerging capabilities as well. So in the example where you have an edge device, an IoT sensor, or a vehicle, or even a drone swarm, in that case, you have a lot of data being fed into you, and you need to create an analysis off that data, and you need a report on that data. So something as simple as creating a report, that's something that generative AI can come into play, and you're able to automatically generate a human-readable report. So I think even simple things like that are really going to be game changers.
He mentions generative artificial intelligence. Machine learning was another term that came up during the course of the study. Ricardo mentions Internet of Things, but 5G underpins a lot of these emerging technologies. Why are those important to the discussion?
So 5G is really important because as the citizenship, right, is changing. Customer experience, citizen experience is changing. They're expecting to interact with government services the way they interact every day. The generational changes are growing up now with iPhones and tablets in their hand, right? Earlier and earlier. So they expect to have those services, and 5G is really going to enable the ability to deliver those services more efficiently and quicker to a lot larger area. Right? You think about the administration now is really putting out executive orders and guidance on improving access to broadband no matter where you live, right? And 5G is going to help with that.
Ricardo, let's dig into some of the results. Generative AI, as you mentioned, quantum computing, AI, ML, deep learning, these ranked in the top 5 emerging technologies, but the study also found that ranked very low are how familiar government employees are with them. Address that disparity for our audience.
Sure. So there's new technologies coming out every single day. AWS itself has over 200 services available, so it can be difficult to identify which ones you need for your mission needs. I think when it comes to generative AI, you've got Amazon Bedrock, where you've got existing foundational models that you're going to be able to use. So that means you don't have to have a background in data science in order to understand how you might be able to use that. Even an individual developer could use something like Code Whisperer, where they're going to be able to generate code automatically find vulnerabilities within their code and really make sure that they're going to be able to create code a lot more faster and effectively. So I think from that perspective, even a general user who isn't aware of how AI works or some of these other technologies, they're going to reap the benefit of it. Even with quantum. So with quantum, there's Amazon Bracket where you can have access to quantum computers, simulators. But even as a general user, when it comes to post-quantum cryptography, you don't have to worry about that. Services like AWS Key Management Service and Secrets Manager, those already have access to post-quantum encryption algorithms. So things like the Kyber, you're going to have that already baked into the technology.
How can their IT leadership, Michael, start to close those gaps? What do they need to do? Is it training? Is it simple familiarity? Is it just a matter of time?
I think we're seeing the government employees become more and more familiar with AI because they're exploring it in their personal life. Right, they're experiencing it out there. What we don't know is some of these emerging technologies are built very quickly, as Ricardo just mentioned, right? It used to be Moore's Law was every 18 months there would be a change. It's no longer months. Sometimes it feels like minutes in our environment, right? There's something new coming out every time. So allowing their employees to have access to sandbox, whether it's through the cloud, like AWS has the ability to create a sandbox, or allowing them to bring those in for short-term pilots, to be able to try them out and see if they work, is definitely one of the ways that the government can actually help their employees get better access to it and actually see if it fits into the mission of what they're trying to accomplish.
Let's drill into some of the potential hurdles that the study outlined. Cost concerns. Did that surprise you at all?
So not really, because that's always a concern when you're trying something new.
Okay.
How much is it going to cost? And how is it going to help me reduce my costs? So I think there's a couple of different areas where you can, partners like GDIT and AWS can help the customer manage that. So, I mean, the first is just going to be scalability and agility. So when you have a capability in the cloud, you're going to be able to scale up quickly and scale down quickly. So the concept of failing fast, while that may not make sense for a production mission, it does make sense for experimentation
Correct.
and pilots that you mentioned.
Yep.
Compatibility with software and services was another concern that was pulled out of there, Michael. And with the speed that these emerging technologies are deployed, is that going to be a persistent challenge for agencies?
I think it's a perception problem because a lot of the emerging technologies nowadays are actually being built with open frameworks, right? They're allowing other software to connect very easily, right, through what's called APIs, right, is one of the ways that they're able to actually talk computer to computer and actually make that integration and implementation a little bit more seamless. I think what we're seeing is some of the legacy equipment that's there, right, that the government is currently working to refresh and remove out, is where some of that doesn't exist. So they're looking for creative ways to do that. But what's really interesting, there are emerging technologies that are being built to solve that problem, to connect the legacy equipment to the newer emerging technologies that are coming out.
In addition to helping agencies address those cost concerns, when you start working with an organization that says, all right, I want to deploy artificial intelligence for the first time. I want to really leverage the Internet of Things and 5G technologies to maximize delivery on my agency's mission. What's the first step, 2 or 3, Ricardo, when you get in there? What are you trying to find out to help them address some of those hurdles, some of those challenges?
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of people want to jump right into migration. What are my 5, 6, or 7 R's? But it really does start with that experimentation and piloting. So creating a POC, identifying a specific use case that you're going to be able to get results from, identify what your baselines are, and really seeing the benefit of what these technologies offer. That's the very first step. And then you can move into laying the foundation and then migration. And then eventually the reiteration and reinvention of what other technologies you're going to incorporate into your pipeline.
I don't know if the camera picked up your chuckle, but jump right into migration prompted one from you, Michael. Why?
Well, so it's interesting when you think about that, because I think the customer needs to also not only do the pilot idea and figure out what the use case is, but establish what good looks like. what does done look like for that pilot, right? It's not an enterprise deployment. You're not trying to get all the way to production. You're really trying to say, we want to do something short term. We want to be able to get out of this quickly if it's not going to work for us. But if it does work for us, we need to know that. So establishing what good looks like and what finished look like is a really critical step that is in that pilot process.
Okay, percentage of budget was another thing that the study looked at. How much should agencies be investing in emerging technologies? I mean, legacy has become, in some cases, a four-letter word for organizations. And are they using emerging tech in the right way to kind of address those issues? Like, how much should they be allotting to emerging tech, Ricardo?
So it's going to depend on the use case and the agency, but when you're expending your budget, you really want to take a look at how you can actually reduce costs. Is this emerging technology actually going to help me reduce my costs? Am I going to be able to modernize my application? Am I going to be able to go serverless? Or am I going to be able to put my individual human resources into other areas because now they no longer have to create those reports, or they're going to be able to focus on other areas of the mission?
Ricardo mentioned earlier in the program scale, and his answer there begs the question to me of how do you help organizations think long-term around costs? Because there may be an initial hurdle, but if they are eventually looking to scale, you got to kind of look further downfield. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually kind of interesting when he said that, because just last year we actually put out a few white papers on this exact topic of changing the conversation from return on investment to return on value, right? Because sometimes there is that upfront cost, but where does that value come from? It is in cost, there is budget constraints, but there's also the efficiency, there's the improving the customer experience. There's all these other things that come into play that you have to look at when you're putting in emerging technology, right? It's not just that short-term gain, it's that long-term play. And GDIT has done a really good job at talking to our customers about what does that roadmap look like, right? We're not just 6 months, but a year, 2 years, 3 years out as we talk to our customers about how they implement these and where they're going to use them.
If I could stay with you for a moment, Michael, the phrase incremental approach comes up during the course of the results. What does that mean to you? So
agile, right? Being agile, right? There's lowercase agile, means you're flexible, then there's the big A agile, right? About agile development processes, right? Where you want to use those, the big A, where you're actually applying that software development type of methodology to the implementation of these emerging technologies, right? We've said it a couple times today where we talk about establishing a pilot so I can actually validate if it's working or not. If it's not working, let's change it. We either need to change our pilot or actually change the technology out. And if the government is looking at how to do that, they have to change the way they buy and the way they think about it, right? And there's a lot of movement within a lot of agencies right now to do that, to say, hey, I want to procure something as a pilot. I don't need to put it as part of a 5-year or a 10-year contract. I'm really putting out this short-term engagement to make sure this works for me.
Ricardo, I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if the word cloud didn't come up during the course of our conversation. What did you take from the results here that stands out to you about the way government is going relative to the cloud?
So I think the big word here that Michael mentioned is agility, and that's what you're getting from the cloud. And regardless of what your mission requirements are, being agile enough to pivot when you need to, that's one big capability that cloud gives you.
Ricardo Paljano, Senior Solutions Architect at Amazon Web Services. Sir, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Michael Cole, Chief Technology Officer for Federal and Civilian at GDIT. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great conversation.
Audience, don't forget, you can download the full study right here in our events platform. Ton of great information in there. We only just touched the tip of the iceberg. Don't go anywhere. The Undersecretary for the Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security joins me next. You're watching Seeds of Change on GovExec TV. Be right back. Welcome back to Seeds of Change. I'm your host, George Jackson. Let's continue today's discussion on emerging technologies with Dr. Dimitri Kusnezov, Undersecretary for the Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. Dimitri, welcome. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you, George. It's great to be part of today's conversation on this. Thank you.
And here in studio with me, GDIT's Senior Director of Emerging Technology, Tim Gilday. Tim, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So, Dimitri, kick us off here. Give some context to this conversation. Tell us a bit about DHS's approach to adopting new IT, adopting emerging technologies.
Emerging technologies are just at a remarkable point in time. It's not just one thing. It's the fact that we have literally dozens of things happening simultaneously, accelerating at many different rates. You know, the most visible in the public eye is certainly ChatGPT and AI, but it's not dissimilar for advanced manufacturing, for autonomous systems and UAS, for gene editing and even next generation networks. They're just these collections of things that provide both remarkable opportunity, but also give you pause in terms of how do we think about the mission of protecting the homeland, our people, and our values in the context of a world changing so fast. So, you know, part of my role at S&T is to look beyond the horizon, to help all the components of DHS, the operational side, to understand, you know, what is in the realm of the possible and what could be transformational for the missions. And it's really a remarkable time to be in this business, unprecedented moment.
I'm going to steal on that phrase, look beyond the horizon, Tim. You mentioned before we went on the air that the accelerated pace of technology is a real challenge for everybody right now. Go into a bit more detail for us.
Yes, as the Undersecretary stated, we already have an increasingly complex landscape to monitor and to educate ourselves on, and add to that the increasing pace of change. So each of these underlying technologies converge to actually accelerate one another, especially underlying supercomputing, underlying artificial intelligence that makes it easier for these other technologies to grow, like CRISPR and gene editing and the like. So the concerns would be, we are used to, as humans, we're used to straight lines, not curved exponential curves. So how do we create a workforce and a culture that's ready to adapt to those types of paces of change, to that disruption, and turn that disruption from something that we're just reacting to something that makes us more resilient?
The Science and Technology Directorate touches a lot of different parts, as you've referenced, Dimitri, of Department of Homeland Security as a whole. Can you walk me through how the work you're doing, how you hope that it benefits the whole of DHS or maybe the whole of government?
So I think there are a couple of different answers to this. In the near term, we are lashed up with all the operational parts of DHS. We work with them each individually on identifying their priorities. We look at their priorities. We have points of contact in S&T that work with appropriate people, and we ask the question based on these ranked items. You know, whether it's from Coast Guard or CBP or ICE or CISA or whichever the components. What are your top areas that you worry about? And we try and ask the question, where can technologies help? Where does technology development or science investment help fill those gaps? And what is it we could deliver in the near term? We also look to see through tech scouting whether products or high TRL 7, 8, or 9 already exist, where just a little nudge or just making the connections can fill those gaps. And so we maintain this running list. It helps really frame the investments we do every year, and we track how we deliver those. And, they do have an impact. When you go through the airport these days, you'll see the fingerprints of S&T everywhere. You might not know it, but these days you just give your ID. You don't have to show your ticket anymore at TSA in a number of places. That's because of technology advancement. recent busts in fentanyl have been accelerated because we've put in AI tools that have helped identify in these massive data sets that we have quality of evidence, values of target, and to try and focus law enforcement efforts, and that has led to recent busts in child exploitation. We've had the same results this year in helping with the release of dozens of children who were in these rings, in these exploitation that happens through streaming video in the dark web. And so a number of efforts, have found their way into market. And so we work actively in saying what tools are ready today or can be pushed in, and we push pretty hard, sometimes working hand in hand, side by side with our components. But we also step back with the luxury of a little more time to think long term without the operational pressures to say, what is it we should be thinking about that could happen tomorrow if we thought about it differently? And that's why emerging technologies today is just a remarkable place to get thinking about what else we could do that would be different.
We just heard before this, Tim, from your colleague Michael Cole about the research that you've been working on for months at this point. That list that Dimitri mentions is long for emerging technologies. Government agencies have to encounter, work with, master a lot of new tools. I'll list off a few here that the study pointed to: machine learning, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, 5G, quantum computing. This is a groundswell, and they could have a really big impact on the federal marketplace. What brings an emerging technology to the forefront? What's important to kind of garner the attention it needs to make those kind of changes in government that agencies are looking for?
It's a great question. There's a lot of factors, right? Necessity is the mother of all invention, so we want to find that there's a reasonable use case. We don't want to just implement emerging technology for the sake of doing that. That being said, sometimes there is a research capacity. We want to get our hands dirty, so there's a balance between the hype of something, just using it because it's a shiny and new technology, versus learning about it because we see that there is promise and potential. And just like Dimitri was saying, sometimes you push hard on these things because you know that there is potential, but you have to figure out the right way to optimize that in the government. Having the petri dish or the sandbox and the culture surrounding the adoption of emerging technology is one of those major factors on whether you have success or not. If you don't have a little bit of free rein, there's a dividing line between pure science and applied science. If you don't have a little bit of rein to experiment and fail and learn from that failure and have a process for ingesting the lessons learned, then there is not as high a level of success. So having that right culture is probably paramount.
Dimitri, how does that comport with your approach at DHS S&T? Necessity is the mother of invention. You're a bit of a petri dish for the Department of Homeland Security, if I boil things down. How do you pick and choose which emerging technologies to take a look at for the department?
So first, I like the way Tim said it. Part of what we have to instill here, and that I'm trying to do, is more of an appetite for taking risk, because the innovation won't succeed if you're unwilling to fail. And so starting and looking more broadly at what the realm of possible opportunities are takes a lot of work, and you have to be willing to say, well, this is a dead end, or this might take too long, or this isn't ready. You have to be willing to explore some things and punt if you need to and move on to others. And so part of it is being willing to be a little more dynamic in how you plan projects and how you reprioritize, how you evaluate things that are low TRL or really at just the research phase. And so that's something we're working on right now. It's a spirit that I'm trying to draw out of our team. I think it is kind of an important dynamic in this space. There's a lot to explore, but it's going to take some risk taking.
What excites you most, Dimitri, like which of those emerging technologies are you most eager or keen to employ across the organization right now?
I think it's something that's a little more cross-cutting. I look at emerging technologies today a little bit like an artist would look at the color wheel, and you'd see red, green, and blue, and you wouldn't say, I can only paint in those colors. I'm going to specialize in red. Artists take that and they create remarkable multimedia by mixing colors together in many ways and creating these just wonderful works of art. I look at emerging technologies, again, AI or UAS or quantum or additive manufacturing or gene editing and nanosciences and as parts of these prime colors. And what excites me is how you blend these together and the doors that those will open, effectively creating new colors. What is the equivalent in the emerging technology space? So it's not specifically about AI or machine learning. Maybe it's machine learning and quantum and UAS together. It's going to be combinations of things like this that get you thinking, wow, I didn't think we could do that. And I think there is this unexplored world of possibilities there that requires some attention. And so I try and stay away of just single focus on the technology.
I love the way he said that, the color wheel. It really speaks to the diverse set of mission objectives for the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, you have the Transportation Security Administration. They have a really unique set of mission objectives. U.S. Coast Guard, same thing. The list goes on and on. Let's go to some of the challenges associated with effectively implementing emerging technology into some of these government organizations, Tim. I mean, the research piece that your team helped to put together pinpoints cost. I don't think that was a huge surprise to anybody, but underneath that list, there are a lot of varied challenges. Anything that you'd like to kind of pull out on, give more context to there?
So first, responding to Dimitri's answer, I wholeheartedly agree. It's almost like you're asking him who his favorite child is. So it's rare that you can have a single silver bullet technology. You have to stack them together in an appropriate way and optimize them, make sure cybersecurity is baked in from the beginning. Hurdles to adoption, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but acquisition cycles. You may have government leaders who know what they want, but it sometimes is very hard. You have to make sure that everything is free, fair, and open. And that cycle to get money out the door for the right technology, especially when it's something that might become obsolete or is quickly evolving, that makes it all the much harder from an acquisition perspective to get that technology in to experiment with it. Another obstacle is just having sufficient technical workforce. So again, it's evolving very quickly, and we don't have a huge talent pool of these extremely advanced AI, machine learning, data analytics, data scientists, and other technologists. So we have to also fight with the private industry to get this talent in. And that's why some of the public-private partnerships that the government employs are so important, to get that outside innovation. Things like AFWorks and others to bring in exceedingly high-end vendors that are experimenting with Silicon Valley types of products. From another perspective, just understanding what the latest capabilities are. Again, government leaders have to do their day job. They have to keep the lights on. They have to make sure operations are running just fine. They cannot also spend that much time keeping abreast of what just came out from generative AI, for example. So making sure that they're plugged into think tanks, research areas and entities, and then also strategic integrators and others that can provide that latest information. That's important, but it's very hard to ingest, as Dimitri was saying, when you have such a complex landscape, to ingest all the right data at the right time to make those up to state-of-the-art types of decisions.
Dimitri, foot stomp something in there or layer onto it some of the challenges that you see to really effectively integrating emerging technologies into the DHS operation.
I think whenever you're trying to bring in new technologies into the operational domain, you have to play a long game there because there is operational risk that is real. that has to be considered. You know, there are ways we operate today that work, and so transitioning in something new is a steady process that has to be paced right, so that you're sure that you haven't done something that will fail in ways that will surprise you. You know, the test and evaluation process, which is part of S&T's responsibility for DHS, you know, is that. But it's challenging with new technologies where we don't always have standards or the right guardrails. And so I think it will become more of a challenge to understand, are we testing everything in the right way? And are there potential misuses or problems that exist outside of those domains that we should be thinking about as well? And so it's not obvious. I think it's going to be a learning curve for many. DHS interacts with you know, millions of citizens every day, perhaps more than most, and consequently we have to be sensitive to the fact that things we put into the field have to be tested and looked over very carefully before we do that. So there is kind of a longer lead time to transition something into practice.
Well, Dr. Dimitri Kusnezov, Undersecretary for the Science and Technology Directorate. Sir, thanks so much for being here.
George, thank you again. Tim, thank you again. Great comments. Enjoyed the conversation.
Tim, stick around. More insights regarding emerging tech and the role it plays in government from Spence Spencer at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office right after this. Welcome back, everyone, to Seeds of Change. I'm your host, George Jackson. Let's wrap up today's discussion on emerging technologies with Spence Spencer, Director of the System Configuration and Delivery Automation Division at USPTO. Spence, welcome.
Thank you.
And here again, Tim Gilday, GDIT Senior Director for Emerging Technology. Welcome back.
Happy to be here.
So, Spence, kick us off. Give us some context. We ended the last conversation with Dr. Kuznetsov on culture. We have seen a bit of a dramatic shift at USPTO over the past few years in that cultural arena. Where does emerging tech come in?
I would say the culture is the most important facet of it. If you look at where we are in terms of agile software development, we tried to do that previously in 2014. And we didn't change our culture enough to accomplish it, and we failed. We spent a lot of money trying to develop new systems to replace the old scary legacy systems that let us down. And without the culture change, we weren't able to accomplish that. We got a new CIO in 2018, Jamie Holcomb, and Jamie changed our culture. We spent about 8 months studying how we do things. And then we adopted what we call new ways of working, which essentially changes the work management from a project-based approach to a product-based approach. So in the old days, and most of government still works this way, you have a project team that comes together for a fixed length of time with a fixed set of resources and a fixed body of work. And they work, and they get to the end of that time, or they get to the end of their money, and hopefully they've delivered something. We don't work that way anymore. We have long-lived product teams that begin with the system when the development begins. The team designs and develops the system. They implement it, they deploy it, and then they maintain it through its life cycle all the way through till it's retired. And that same team essentially has a lifetime that matches the lifetime of the system. So they take a lot of ownership of that. There's a lot of institutional memory. And they don't have to try to beat the clock with development. They can start to deliver value very early in the system development cycle, and they can deliver value in small increments, agility. That lowers your risk, right? That ability to deliver every day value to the customer lowers what used to be called project risk. But we know we're going to deliver value every day. It's the only question is, which piece is the higher priority that we want to work on next? We're allowed to fail. But with that agility, when you fail, you learn from the failure, you reset, you try again, and you move on to the next approach. And eventually you'll succeed. That's the big culture change that Jamie Holcomb brought to us. And everybody in the Office of the Chief Information Officer is working that way now. We're entirely agile.
Delivering every day, one key pull-out that I have there, but delivering from everywhere is also a bit of a sea change, not just for USPTO, but for all of government, Tim. I'm talking specifically about the shift to remote work, telework, and you can jump back in here if you want to in a moment, sir, but I'd love a cross-government view of that. Has this shift to remote-enabled workforces really had a spurring impact on the implementation of emerging technology in government?
Well, back to our conversation with Dimitri, necessity is the mother of invention. So we had no choice. We had to figure out very quickly, and it forced us to experiment. And as quickly as possible, we figured out what systems could we use for virtual communication, how could, especially in secure environments, how do we transmit data and still do productive work when we're not in a SCIF or when we're not in an office with secure boundaries. So it did take a lot of experimentation, and some people had to sacrifice. We couldn't go 100% remote. Some people, from a national security perspective, still had to continue. But for the rest of the government, that posed an issue, not only from a tech perspective, but how do you measure productivity? So in USPTO, it seems like the culture is a little bit more forward-leaning. You already had oriented towards product instead of project, so you know what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve. You're more sprint-based. You know features incrementally coming out. But sometimes, in old-fashioned way of running business, you see somebody sitting there for 8 hours and you assume that they are doing their day's work. When they're at home, if you haven't been thinking about the products or the outcomes that they're trying to achieve, it's harder. So actually, I think that was a side benefit or a silver lining to the situation, because it forced us to manage more clearly and make sure that we have outcome-driven activities, not just, are you sitting in that seat?
Anything you wanted to add there, Spence, from a USPTO perspective?
I completely agree with that. We had a strong telework culture even going into the pandemic. If you think back to that time in March 2020, overnight I personally went from not being permitted to telework to being told I had to telework. So I went from no telework at all to 100% telework. When you leave today, literally the quote was, when you leave today, take your laptop with you. You're not going to see your office for a while. And we figured it would be 2 or 3 weeks. And it was, I think, 19 months before I saw the inside of my office again. But the funny thing is, at PTO, I don't think we missed a step. When I look back on that time, I was fairly new to my current position. I'd only been in my position for a month at that point. The team there was a lot of fear around the pandemic, but the team adapted very quickly to the telework. We produce software. We don't really ever put our hands on anything physical, at least in my small division. So we were a natural fit for telework. And what we found was that our folks thrived in that environment. Once they got over the fear of the pandemic, they felt a sense of security. They knew their jobs weren't at risk. We knew we would be able to be productive, and we started to see those results immediately. And the interesting thing is that I had some hiring to do. I had 3 open positions at the beginning of that. So we filled those 3 positions during the pandemic. And we told folks, you're going to get hired, you're going to be a Fed. This is a partial telework position, but expect one day you're going to have to go back in the office. Well, it kept going. And then a year goes by, and a year and some change goes by, and I hired some more folks. And then in May of 2022, the office announced that we were going to allow most positions to be fully remote indefinitely, forever. So we basically said we're not going back to our offices. And at that point, my team was 50% folks that had hired during the pandemic and 50% folks that started before the pandemic that had been teleworkers, but now they were full-time teleworkers. We hadn't seen each other in a year and a half. Think about that. I had employees that worked for me that were federal employees, permanent federal employees, that had never been in the building, didn't have an office in the building.
Spence, I have a question about that. So there are some pros that we're talking about,
Sure.
and you were able to retain that momentum, but then there are some difficulties, right? The water
difficulties.
cooler talk,
Right,
the
right.
innovation that comes from being face-to-face. So how did your agency overcome that and make sure that there was a constant innovation?
This is an area that's very close to my heart because it was one of the things that I felt early on that was missing, right? We want that team spirit, that esprit de corps, if you will, and not seeing each other was problematic from that perspective. So early on, even when we couldn't sit face to face, we started doing happy hours in the evening. We would switch from the government WebEx to a private Zoom, and you'd open a bottle of wine, and we would say it's not duty time, so this is optional and it doesn't count. But we'd sit there on camera and we would do what you would normally do in a happy hour at a bar. And we did that remotely, and it built that connection between the folks in the division. And then as time went by, the pandemic became less scary. So we started getting together. First, it was outdoors with pizzas in a park near the office. And then later on, we'd get together and we'd have dinner or something like that. We've done paintball. We do an optional in-office day every alternate Tuesday. The folks that want to come in are welcome to come in. None of us have permanent offices anymore, so we're in hoteling offices. But we make sure we all sit together, and we do our daily stand-up in a real conference room with face-to-face, like we never do. And we go have lunch. So those are the kind of intangibles that it's not really a technical conversation, but it's a cultural conversation. And you can't have that level of agility without trust. And a big part of trust is knowing each other.
Right.
I think connected to this too, Tim, is this concept of digital divide. There is a key focal point inside of the Biden administration right now that has been delivered down, through the cabinet level agencies to really focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. Can you talk about how those concepts apply to emerging technology?
Generally, in a big scale, I think plenty of studies have shown that corporations, entities, agencies, teams that are more diverse from all areas, diversity of thinking, diversity of backgrounds, underprivileged, highly privileged. If you have those cross-functional teams with different experiences, you tend to have higher innovation rates and on average, higher success rates. And there's a variety of studies around that. Culturally, though, putting that in place is difficult. Again, harking back to our conversation with Dimitri, program leaders in the government have to keep the lights on. They are very busy just doing their day job. But it's something that they have to inject with intent. They have to make sure that they are putting time on the calendar, like Spence was talking about, to make sure they connect with individuals, with their teams, so that they're having bi-directional communication. And I think also putting processes in place that allow for idea submission or concern submission, whether it's anonymous or direct. You have to have multiple methods for people so that they feel safe to have that constant communication. Because without that communication, that's where the innovation can dry up.
Stops right there, absolutely.
That's an internal and an external challenge for USPTO, and one that you are keen to address, right? You have internal stakeholders, employees, but you also have people seeking patents. How does diversity, equity, and inclusion apply to both of those lenses, Spence?
Well, it's an important concept. It's a departmental level priority. Secretary Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, has made it a priority for the entire Department of Commerce. It's also a priority at the office. Kathy Vidal feels very strongly, our office director feels very strongly about that. So we do things like small inventor outreach. We have the patent and trademark public advisory committees that meet quarterly, where the community, the IP community, gives us feedback about what they think about the laws and regulations and how we're doing. How do our systems work? How is the experience from an inventor's perspective? We do it internally. We have town halls. At a very local level, I meet one-on-one with all of my staff individually every other week at least. They have 30 minutes of my undivided attention one day every 2 weeks. And I don't know what we're going to talk about. It's their meeting, it's not mine. I'm just making myself available to them. and they can talk about whatever. I had a conversation on Monday. I have an employee that lives in California. We talked about surfing. Well, that's pretty cool. But that builds that level of trust and that communication. And that employee feels that they're literally able to talk to me about anything, and that's important. You got to be available for your folks. You've got to pay attention. Hugely important.
Let's draw back to the study itself, Tim, for a moment. Cybersecurity, one of the key underpinnings through all of the sort of employment of emerging technologies. Walk us through why it's a part of everything these days.
Yeah, you may have heard the term zero trust. So that's an all-encompassing understanding of people, processes, and technology when it comes to cybersecurity. So if we just go and implement a project to get the outcome done without thinking of cybersecurity, we are leaving the door open to 100 different types of risks from the people, processes, and technology area. And as we have an increasingly complicated landscape and the IT environments in the government are increasingly complicated, we need to find ways to better monitor the risks that we know about, but then also identify risks and disruptions that we don't know, the unknown unknowns. We know they're out there, and we find it likely that somebody is going to be in our systems at any given time, so we can't just have a great perimeter. We also need to have better ways to detect when systems are broken into. So from the cybersecurity perspective, we say shifting left, right? You want it to not be an afterthought bolted on to a project or a technical implementation. You want it to be baked in with every step. And so you've seen plenty of government agencies try to create incentives or benefits for using processes or tools and having checkpoints before they can go on to the next point. A lot of times it's not mandated, but it's so beneficial to getting an ATO, an authority to operate, that many will be drawn to using this set of processes. So that's what we're trying to support across government, and I think that's something that USPTO does innately.
Spence, as we bring this conversation to a close, we've covered a lot of ground. Some of it technological, some of it cultural, some of it philosophical,
Sure.
DEIA. We've talked a little bit about emerging tech and why cybersecurity is important to it, but leave us with one of the biggest challenges for the future that you're trying to address right now. What is top on your sort of hit list there?
Well, I think, Tim, you said it, I think security, the cybersecurity aspect, that's one of our top priorities in the CIO office at Patent and Trademark. It's our three for the year are cybersecurity, resiliency, and moving to the cloud, moving out of a government data center. We are baking that security process into our development cycle. It literally starts with the first line of code. We have things that look at what we call supply chain risk, the components that we get from somewhere else, things that other people wrote. We look at what the provenance of those are. We look at whether they're fresh, whether they're kept up to date or not. For things that are components, we look at, are there versions that have known flaws? And if there are, we need to warn that product team that they have a potential risk that they need to deal with. And it may be a critical risk. Maybe something like SolarWinds or Log4j or one of those big nightmare vulnerabilities that we dealt with recently. We want to catch those as early as we can, preferably before it deploys to production. And if we can catch that before it deploys to production, that's obviously the best outcome. You're never vulnerable. But if something pops up, the sooner you know about it, the faster you can react. And having that agility that Jamie has had, the bold courage to allow us to do, lets us react very quickly. We can roll system updates. My own team has done it in under a day, literally from finding out about the vulnerability to having the remediation in production, tested, verified, and available to the community. We did it in 19 hours. There's not many teams in government that can go that fast, but my team can go that fast. And the cool thing about it is that the day after, we weren't wrecked. We had a normal day the day after that. We didn't have outages. We didn't have broken stuff. We got those patches out. We succeeded in mitigating that vulnerability. And then we went back to where we were beforehand. And that's a wonderful thing to be. That's what that's the payoff for those cultural changes. Having a smart, diverse, trusted team that knows what they need to do, that you don't have to micromanage. They will give you the result that you want. They'll do it very quickly if you let them. The trick is you have to trust them to do the right thing.
Well, like any good raconteur, he has brought us full circle. Spence Spencer, U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And Tim Gilday, GDIT, always a pleasure.
Thank you both.
And thank you, the audience, for tuning in. Download the full study right here in our event platform. There are a ton of great insights in there. Today's conversations are clearly just a starting point as emerging tech dramatically reshapes the way government delivers on mission. For GovExec TV, I'm George Jackson. Have a great day.